I'm Sharon Israel, and this is Planet Poet Words in Space. It's my pleasure to welcome Poet Laureate Emeritus of Sullivan County, New York, Eric Baylin. We'll discuss his tenure as Poet Laureate, hear his poems, and talk about his life as a sculptor and teacher. Hi, Eric.
Hi, Sharon.
I'm going to read your bio for our listeners. Eric Baylin, poet and sculptor, lives in Sullivan County, New York, in the village of North Branch. He served as Sullivan County Poet Laureate for 2021 to 22, a role sponsored by the Sullivan County Library Association. He taught visual art for 52 years, working with all ages from preschool through college, and recently retired after 37 years at Packer Collegiate Institute in Brooklyn. As Poet Laureate, Eric sought to give poetry a public face in Sullivan County and to encourage the reading and writing of poetry among county residents of all ages. To fulfill his goals, he gave workshops, organized and presented poetry events, including the first Sullivan County Youth Poetry Festival held at Bethel Woods in April 2022, and Sylvan Land, the Spirit of Sullivan in word and song at the Tusten Theatre in Narrowsburg. In his work as a sculptor, Eric uses elements from nature, tree branches and stones gathered from nearby fields and streams to create temporary site-specific installations exhibited at galleries in Sullivan County. Eric is also a longtime meditator, a practice that fuels and sustains both his poetry and art. And Eric, you've recently moved full-time to Sullivan County, and but you've been here for a longer period of time. Would you tell us a little bit about your residence in the county itself?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I've had a home in Sullivan County in the village of North Branch, a very small community in the sort of the northwestern part of Sullivan County. And I've had that home for 26 years and moved here full-time 3 years ago. So when the pandemic began and teaching became virtual online, and I was teaching my students through Zoom from my studio in North Branch.
And why Sullivan County? Why did you settle there?
Well, I had been visiting a meditation center there for a number of years. I just love the place. I love the landscape, the feeling of the place. And I had grown up in North Carolina among woods, and it felt very familiar. And I knew that though I lived in New York City, I always wanted to come back to the country. So this was coming home.
How did you make the position your own? I know you, throughout your career, you've used art to build community as a teacher. And how did you start becoming the Poet Laureate? How did you apply for the laureateship, if I may?
Well, I didn't know about the Sullivan County Poet Laureateship until I was attending the 50th anniversary of Woodstock and an Arlo Guthrie concert, and the MC introduced a fellow who's as the Poet Laureate of Sullivan County. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I had no idea that such a role existed. And then a few years later, my sister-in-law saw a little ad in the Sullivan County Democrat, the local newspaper, and said, hey, they have an application for the Poet Laureate of Sullivan County. She says, why don't you apply for it? Kind of smiling jokingly. I sort of took it as somewhat of a family dare. Would you dare do that? I said, yeah, I would. And I did.
Such a casual reference can be so life-changing, right?
Yes, it was truly life-changing, yeah.
And how did you make the position your own? How did you start being the Poet Laureate?
Well, that was interesting because along with the title, there was no roadmap. They said, congratulations, and go forth without any real map of what to do other than contact the local librarians. But as you said, I wanted to make poetry. I wanted to give poetry a public face in the county. So how was I to do that? I just started contacting people who were in charge of events like the county, the local town festivals. Almost every town had some kind of festival. So I found out who was leading them and said, hey, I'm the Poet Laureate of Sullivan County. You want a poem? And so many of them said, Yes, and it was great fun, and there was a feeling of exuberance about it.
Mm.
I just loved doing it, and I loved the idea of bringing poetry into these community spaces. And so one by one thing led to another. I met more and more people, and people got to know my name, and sometimes I got invited to read a poem here or there, and then started leading workshops at the libraries. So
Wonderful.
it was great
And
fun.
your love of the place helped too. I mean, there's probably a natural exuberance there with your love
Oh,
of
yes.
where you lived. You know the county so well.
Yeah, and I learned to about the county. One of my goals was to learn even more about the county. So I spent a lot of time driving around. I got maps. It's hard to find a map of Sullivan County these days, but I found one, and I traveled all over little towns and meeting people. And the county historian was a great help to me. He was
Hmm,
knew the county inside and out and told me all kinds of things that were very helpful.
great. Eric, would you read an excerpt from the winning entry?
And just a little background about it.
Sure.
The application form said, please submit a poem that speaks to the spirit of Sullivan County, however you might interpret that. And so I had written this poem several years before, and I thought it was so absolutely spot on about the spirit of Sullivan County. It's entitled Pancake Breakfast at the Firehouse. What drew us there, beyond the magnetic pull of the phrase pancake breakfast, was the alluring bonus in the newspaper announcement with real maple syrup. We've been to many of these at fire stations scattered among the local towns, each with its own version of pancakes, light and fluffy, dense and hearty, thin with a bit of chewiness. Like so many others, we are lovers of pancakes, especially those drenched in the real deal. And beyond the fundamental draw of this iconic breakfast, the events are a sort of joyful community theater where normal roles are suspended and everyone plays a different part for the day. The volunteer firemen, mechanics, electricians, and farmers are nattily dressed in navy blue trousers, stiff white shirts topped with red aprons, doubling now as pancake chefs and waiters. The patrons, a mix of locals and weekenders, are both audience and actors in the play. They come as entire families with babies in tow and elderly couples bent with canes. They are salt of the earth folks and tattoo-peppered hipsters from the city. Pancakes cut through layers of economic and social strata. Pancakes unite. We sit together at long tables and engage in light banter about the weather, where we come from. The women talk more than the men and keep the fare light and breezy. The electrician, fireman, waiter asks for our order, scrambled or over easy, and soon returns, having forgotten who had ordered what. Soon after, platters of steaming pancakes arrive, thin ones, almost crepe-like. The fellow to my left piles a stack high, rolls it, and wraps his over-easy eggs into the mix. He knows his pancakes. The woman next to him, an enthusiastic pancake maven, wants the recipe. All of us kindly pass the platters around and pour the syrup, which spills dark and golden down the sides of the metal pitcher. For 4 hours, the crowd streams in and out, as steady as the syrup flows, and soon enough, the whole thing comes to an end like a circus tent, folded at the end of the day. The restaurant returns to just the firehouse, and a large crowd of happily fed actors returns to their respective roles.
That's Eric Baylin, Poet Laureate Emeritus of Sullivan County, reading his laureate-winning poem, excerpt from it, Pancake Breakfast at the Firehouse. That was so lovely and so true. The real deal, like the maple syrup and all the roles that people take. I've been to, it's the essence of what country life is like up here.
Right.
Really, really lovely.
Thank
Eric, you've done so much during your tenure. I mean, your readings, I mean, you have here, you read in Callicoon Country Fair, the Monticello Bagel Festival, the Jeffersonville Jamboree. Now, these are readings that you put together or you read at?
They were events that I again offered my service as
right. So these are as a reader, as a
yes,
poet.
as a reader,
Yes.
yes.
And then you gave many workshops, Zoom meetings, workshops. There's one in particular that seems so interesting about Ukrainian poetry. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. The well, I was giving these workshops around mostly about seasonal themes. We did one for Halloween, one for the gratitude and Thanksgiving, one for the beginning of the year. And then a friend had suggested to me that why don't we do one with about Ukrainian poets? And that so intrigued me. The information we have about this war comes from the newspaper, and I thought, what about the poets? What are the Ukrainian poets saying, writing about? And so I started, and I didn't know anything. So I started researching and found this incredibly rich vein of Ukrainian poetry that reaches way back into the 19th century with this revered poet named Taras Shevchenko, and then wonderfully, I knew that there was a Ukrainian community in Sullivan County around Glen Spey in the southern part of the county. And so, and the only street in Sullivan County named after a poet is Taras Shevchenko Street in Glen Spey. And I thought that was wonderful. And so I invited a prominent member of the Ukrainian community to read in Ukrainian, the poems that we had selected. And then I had a wonderful group of friends who love poetry to read the translations. It was very moving because these poems, I mean, this conflict with Russia goes way, way back. And the poets have been writing about it for really decades and decades. So even the older poems spoke to the current situation. It was quite moving and quite a wonderful win. This was on Zoom, by the way.
It sounds great. Was it open to audiences outside of Sullivan?
Yes, it was attended by people who outside of the county as well. Anybody who had the link. That was the wonders of Zoom. You can come, you can attend anywhere.
A beautiful event. And you created the Sullivan County Youth Poetry Festival. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Certainly. Well, that was one of my most wonderful projects during the year. I'd been teaching for virtually my whole life. I loved working with kids, and I thought, well, we've got to do something with the kids in the county. So I proposed this poetry festival, youth poetry festival, and I just again started talking to one person and the next person and finding out who could tell me what to do. I had no idea. I didn't have any access to this. I had access to one school, a private school in the southern part of the county. And then one by one, people started emerging and say, "Oh, that sounds like a wonderful idea." Yes. And then where are we going to do it? And so he says, "Well, why don't you try for Bethel Woods? Go for broke."
Wow. Bethel Woods, if people don't know, is a very large venue.
Very large venue, and it's the site of the original Woodstock Festival, and it's very, very beautiful. And the people there were so gracious and helped me in all kinds of ways, and said, "Yes, let's do it here." And so I contacted teachers, and quite a few of them were very enthusiastic, and they got their kids. I sent them prompts. I said, "Have your kids write poems that are about their lives themselves, like who am I, where did I come from, what's my story, and what am I going to do with my life, where am I going?" And so they wrote poems. I had more than 70 entries. Somebody said, "Hey, be happy if you get 15," and that was my goal, happy if I get 15. And they kept coming and coming, and suddenly I had 70. We made a booklet of them. All the poems were printed into a booklet, and more than 100 people came to this event. It was absolutely stunning. They were so eager to read their poems to this audience. And to me, this was like truly the power of poetry, is to be able to speak, to raise your voice through these words and talk about these very personal things in ways that might not happen except through a poem. And so some of the kids were so confident and just thrilled to read their poems, and others were so shy. They were bending down over the microphone. They'd have a friend with them, with their hand on their shoulder, saying, you can do this, you can do this." And they did. It was wonderful.
Eric, I have a feeling your exuberance and commitment had a lot to do with the success of this event. And it's a from scratch, from nothing. Amazing. And you've done so many. And was there a budget for your tenure?
There
How
was
did
a,
that
there was a
work?
modest, well, there was a modest budget. And there was not a budget for the poetry event itself, the youth poetry event. I needed money to. So one of the teachers said, "Look, if you want to get kids to do this, you need to offer some prizes." And I would never have done that. I wouldn't have given prizes for art, but I said this is a very practical. So I went around and raised money. I went to the local organizations and said who gave money to different kinds of events, and they willingly gave me. I raised $1,000 to cover all the costs, and one of the local bakeries said you can have all the donuts wholesale, and so we
Oh,
a
that's
lot of
great.
donuts and bagels wholesale, and it was fun, and I met a lot of people doing that too. It was another part of the role that was quite
Part of the
interesting.
fun. And you have a couple of more events. I mean, you have many. Words and Sounds of Wood, a presentation of poetry and music around the subject of wood. And that involved, can you tell briefly about that? I mean, that sounds fascinating. Did that just
Yeah.
come to you? That idea come to you?
Well, the idea was born from an exhibit that I was curating with a friend, and that came before I got the Poet Laureate position. It was an exhibit about wood. We entitled it "For the Love of Wood," and it was inviting craftsmen and artists who loved using wood in all kinds of ways. It was a wonderful, wonderful exhibit of local artists and craftsmen. And then, being in the role of Poet Laureate, I said, "Hey, why don't we do something in conjunction with this show that using poetry and music about that had to do with wood?" So I contacted some of the poets that I knew in the area, and they started spreading the word and said, "Hey, you got a poem about wood, or you want to write one about wood?" And we had a wonderful, wonderful selection of poems, and also musicians. I invited a songwriter friend to write a song, a beautiful song about that she wrote, and then other musicians played, and then a musician who made instruments, his homemade instruments out of wood, and it was great. And for that event, I did create a spontaneous improv where I invited all the participants to submit a word that related to wood as they came in. And we had all these slips of paper. And then two of the other poets and I, along with a musical accompaniment, started reading the words. And everybody in the audience had two pieces of kindling, which they used as rhythm sticks. So the whole place came alive with this
It's
kind
very
of,
John Cage of you also.
it was very John Cagey,
It
yes.
really, you did an experimental event and nobody knew you were doing that. So they weren't as inhibited about it. And
It was
you're also a songwriter, and you will hear one of your songs later on in the show. You also created your last event. Would you describe that, Sylvan Land, that was held at the Tusten Theatre in Narrowsburg? I love Narrowsburg. It's a beautiful town.
Yeah, it is a beautiful town. It's a wonderful little theater too. Well, this came about as a way of I'd written all these poems during the course of the year, and I'd written songs, and I thought, well, I just read them at these various events and not as a single piece of work. And I thought, well, why don't I just put them together and as a program. Originally, I was going to invite a lot of other people to read, but I had so much material. I thought, well, hey, this will be fun. And people said, go do it. And somebody said, why don't you try for the Tusten Theatre in Narrowsburg? So again, I asked the folks at Delaware Valley Arts Alliance, and they graciously said, yeah, sure, let's do it. So it was, and I wrote some poems especially for that event that I'd been thinking about over the course of the year. So I read the ones that I'd written over the year. I invited a few other people to read some poems, including the county historian had told me that there was a wonderful 19th century poet named Alfred B. Street who wrote exclusively about Sullivan County, and they're quite wonderful. He was well known in his time, not so much now. So I had someone read one of his poems, and then other people played music, and I sang songs. It was quite an event.
Great. Of course, you have to do the publicity for all these events. That this has happened in just by itself.
My background as a visual artist helped with that too. So just making posters, this, that, and the
Oh,
other.
that's great. So, Eric, would you read two of your poems, Bagel and Ode, which I think is a great title, an ode to the bagel. Would you read an excerpt from that, please, for us?
Sure, yes. This is one that I wrote for the Bagel Festival in Monticello. And I thought, what fun to write a poem about bagels. I sort of like, if I could sort of channel my Neruda ode self, and if he'd written, he wouldn't have written this one, I can assure you, but
you never know.
Bagel and ode. Picture it, a classic plain, golden brown orb, smooth-skinned, almost but not quite shiny, its yeast-bulging shoulders swelling into its iconic open center, the renowned emptiness around which bagel history has gathered. That is to say, the whole that makes the roll a true bagel. And note how a bagel's chew factor is another test of the true. Teeth must grip the tough skin while one or even two hands tug in opposition. The first bite reveals the soft, stretchy interior where one encounters, yes, a soft pillow of tangy cream cheese. And, oh, if it's warm, I mean straight from the oven hot, then you have entered the sphere of bagel nirvana right here on this earth where life with a warm bagel and bountiful schmear is good. My first, I imagine, was almost certainly in Baltimore. Maybe I was 4, and most likely served on a silver platter in my grandmother's living room amidst family chatter, assorted plain poppy and sesame amidst piles of whitefish, lox, corned beef, and tongue. Almost certainly, bagel initiation took place there at that young age, as we had no bagels in Carolina, maybe Linder's frozen, before the New York bagel man came south to spread word of the bread with a hole, to demonstrate the rhythm of rolling, boiling, baking, honed in Poland, finally tuned in New York and Brooklyn, before bagel mania rolled through the land, like a 1,000-wheeled bagel mobile heading northwest and south from New York.
That's Eric Baylin reading an excerpt from his Bagel and Ode. I found that very Carl Sandburg, sort of very muscular, witches of the world. You know, it was very, very funny. And you must read an excerpt from your narrative poem Pudding Tour. That I will just say that traced Eric's adventure of sampling rice pudding at the diners strung along Highway 17. And I love diners and I love rice pudding, so I want to hear this, Eric.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Pudding tour of Sullivan diners. Mostly strung along the central artery of 17, the diners differ and resemble. Some harken back with little change, and others sway with changing tides. The menu may take days to navigate, some 40 pages, I exaggerate. An array of chicken sandwiches alone can boggle minds. In most, the central feature, all-day breakfast, is alluring. Over easy, even poached at midnight, somehow reassures. But putting pancakes to the side, the subject now is pudding. Rice specifically, the spoonable, familiar, smooth conclusion to a meal, or simply stand alone with whipped or not. So here's the plan. Embarking on this tour of diners with a pudding state of mind, I aim to sample the familiar and so in doing forge a pudding trail that spans the county, booth to booth. The northernmost in Roscoe is my starting point and closest to the whiz of 17. The famous one, they tout it large in letters sprawled across the walls, perhaps renowned beyond the county, state, and country. This one swims with currents, etched glass fishermen, and neon. College pennants dance on walls, announcing schools from miles around, some you never heard of. Mary Ann, the waitress, dark hair, dark-rimmed glasses, pink magenta top and apron black, with Roscoe's neatly threaded red, steps to the table with her pad and opening line, "What can I get you?" "Some tea and pudding." "Rice," I say. And Mary Ann says bluntly, unapologetically, "We don't have rice pudding anymore." "You're kidding," came a gasp of disbelief. "No pudding, rice, no chocolate even? Puddingless in Roscoe?" Folks stopped ordering it years ago, she said. It just went bad, so we stopped making it. What sort of diner earns its famous chops without rice pudding in the mix? I ordered blintzes. Sort of creamy. Later, she said, maybe next time. But I knew there'd be no next time for pudding here in Roscoe. Thanks. I'll call ahead, I said. She smiled and handed us the bill.
That's Eric Baylin reading Pudding Tour. Wow, you're such a great reader, Eric. That was fabulous. I love the eggs poached at midnight and the puddingless in Roscoe. I mean, that's like a little novel there, puddingless in Roscoe. How dare they? This is Planet Poet Words in Space at WIOX Community Radio. I'm Sharon Israel, your host, here with the Poet Laureate Emeritus of Sullivan County, New York, Eric Baylin. Joining us now is Planet Poet's Poet at Large, writer and visual artist Pamela Manché Pearce. Pamela is proud to have sold her collage Girlfriends in the annual Visual AIDS Postcards from the Edge benefit sale to support artists with HIV/AIDS. Hello, Pamela.
Hello, Sharon. Hello, Eric. I'm so happy to be here today. And I cannot resist mentioning that we lost the wonderful poet Charles Simic. His obituaries in the Times today, and he must be smiling down on this because he is the poet of ordinary objects and the everyday, and he would love those pancakes and the maple syrup and those bagels. I know it. I believe he was another poet laureate. I believe he was Poet Laureate of the United States. You know, this is a great opportunity for me to talk about something that I find really interesting. You know, one of the things that I love about being on the show is I learn. I have to research subjects and learn things that I didn't know before. Today, I'm going to talk about the poetry form, the lyric poetry form, the aubade. The definition is, an aubade is a poem or a piece of music appropriate to dawn or early morning, a love poem or a song lamenting the arrival of the dawn. It does usually recall the joy and closeness of the lovers in the darkness and the grief and weight of their longing for each other that will be lost with the dawn. Often, you know, I'm thinking about operas and even certain movies where the night watchman is calling out the dawn, and he is the one who is interrupting the beautiful night that the lovers are having and alerting them that the end is about to happen.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
I mean, this watchman, this anonymous figure signaling the end to something absolutely wonderful. You know, the aubade comes from the Spanish word albada or alba, which means dawn. And this was taken by French troubadours in medieval France and translated into the word aubade, which is the one that we work with now. The one we have now is aubade. This form originated in medieval France as poems of lovers parting at dawn. And these troubadours were actually the original lyric poets. When you think about these men in these outrageous costumes and strumming and reciting poetry. Traditionally, it's a male lover leaving a sleeping woman, lamenting the end of the night of love. These troubadours were representatives of the Provençal school of courtly love, an experience that went between the erotic and the spiritual attainment in the high Middle Ages, 11th and 1200s. This was a time of religious fervor in Christianity, and also these knights were returning from the Crusades, and they had experienced, they had learned something new about mystical relationships in life from the Islamic poet and literature of a very different part of the world. Also, this was castle culture time. The men were returning, and now there were a lot more men in the castles than there were before. Previously it was just all women when the men were all in the Crusades, but now there were conditions in these castles where it was a very male-heavy population. All the women were married. Most of the women of marriage age were married, but these marriages were business relationships. There was no romance or erotic connection there. It was a business transaction and to have children. So these nights were involved in bringing romance and passion and excitement into the lives of these women and producing these adulterous relationships that were going on.
Boy.
Pretty exciting. What you know, Sharon, is that in my experience with being poet at large on Planet Poet, one of my favorite things is to find an ancient root to something that is either happening in modern times or any other time period. So after doing a little scratching, I went back and I found that one of my favorites, Ovid, the Roman poet Ovid, inspired all of this in his Ars Amatoria. He discussed or described pictures of lovers as slaves of passion, sighing, trembling, growing pale and sleepless, and even dying for love. But, so this was taken up with a resurgence and a reinterest in things ancient, also in the 11th and 12th century. This idea was connected to the spiritual dimension of these romances. I'm always delighted to read my own work on the air. I feel very privileged to have that opportunity. So now I'm going to read my own Obad, in which I turn the tables. So it's me, a woman, leaving a man who is sleeping, which is against the traditional form. It's a poem in progress, which is set in Crete, where I spent 4 summers, and I created a memoir called Blue Crete, 4 Summers of Love and Remembrance, which is in the pre-publication stage. This poem is called Muse. White curtains open, his tan skin against the white sheets, absent from my body in sleep. I want to remember it. Dawn was magnificent. This trip over and all the tears in the corner of the room unzipped. Nightgown thrown down, more precious than the luggage. Christos rolls over to embrace me. I want him so close. My arms try to get all of him in warm sheets. Our bed, our heaven, us about to be torn apart. Our feast about to end. The alarm clock sounds. My trip in kisses, in the suitcase, zipped. What can I take with me but this? Our last morning ever. I concentrate on details. He's lost in sleep. High above, Suda Bay.
Oh, that is so poignant.
Thank you,
So
Sharon.
sad and beautiful.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm very pleased to have had these opportunities, these experiences in my life. So
you
thank
have brought that tradition into such immediacy. And when you're talking about the troubadours, also, you made them come alive. It was totally understandable to a contemporary person why that was going on. And we have troubadours, we have food, we have love, we have Obad. Thank you so much, Pamela Manché Pearce, poet at large extraordinaire. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. It was, as always, it was absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Delaware, Delaware, always there, always there. Delaware, Delaware, the timeless flow. The river gleams, the river streams, and it seems the river dreams. Delaware, Delaware, the river knows. Round the bends, through the eddies, waters swirl, waters curl. Leap in rocks, through the grasses it unfurls. Never starts, it never stops. Under moonlight, under sun. Has no day, it has no night, it's never done. Delaware, Delaware, always there, always there. Delaware, Delaware, the timeless flow. The river gleams, the river streams, and it seems the river dreams. Delaware, Delaware, the river knows.
Isn't that lovely? And what a beautiful voice, Eric, that you have. So lovely. That was Eric Baylin, songwriter as well as sculptor and poet and organizer phenomenal of that's not a word of the of his tenure as Poet Laureate of Sullivan County. But you are a songwriter, and you wrote that The River Knows for the Sylvan Land event that we had discussed. Is that right, Eric? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I had written that early on in my tenure. I actually wrote it and sang it. It was one of the first things I wrote, and I sang it at the Calhoun County Fair Festival, Country Fair Festival, and that was Calhoun is right on the river, and again, it was like an ode to this wonderful river. I love that river, and it's such a huge part of the county and the life of the county, it was the first song I'd written many lyrics, but I'd never written the music. I wrote the music as well to this one. So,
is that the first time you've written the music to a song?
No. Yeah, it was the first time.
That's pretty impressive. Yeah, it's a very poignant melody, actually.
Thank you.
Very well.
Thank you.
Very well with the feelings you get when you watch a river. It's a sadness and a peaceful evocation of beauty, I think. I want to read a quote from a piece that in the River Reporter, written by Anne Marie Schutz, I think her name is, conversation with metaphor that she had with you, Eric. And this is something that I lifted from that piece that you said. Poetry happens when words stop me in my tracks. A poem is made of words, but they are words with a rhythm, words that push you to reflect, quote, to dip below the surface of our language, quote. And that's really lovely. How has being Poet Laureate changed your poetry, Eric, if it has? Would you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I was thinking about that question. What it did was especially heighten my awareness of audience. That when I'm writing poetry, I find out I always have an audience in mind. Sometimes it's one person, sometimes it's a group of people, but I always feel like I'm writing to someone with someone in mind. And so having a number of different audiences in this role helped me really refine my understanding of how to attune my poetry for the audience. Like there was one situation where I was asked to write poetry for kids, which was so much fun. But that's a totally different than writing, say, for adults. However, writing for kids, I was also writing for the kid and adults, so that adults who heard the poems loved the poems as well. And then I write. I'm sort of a contemplative by nature. I am a meditator and a contemplator, and so many of my poems are quite contemplative, but those are not poems that I would necessarily stand up at the Bagel Festival and read. I was writing, I was very attuned to audience and I wanted poetry to be accessible. I didn't want it to be something that was highfalutin or overly fancified. And I wanted it to be real and to touch people where they lived. So I was really learning about how to align my words and my poems with who I was speaking to, because that was very important. That was a big takeaway from the time.
Eric, you started writing poetry in a very particular way. Would you tell us how you started writing in your life?
Well, one summer, it was the summer of 2009, and as a teacher, I always had this luscious, wonderful 10-week summer in between school years. And so that summer, I had been writing occasionally, and I'd written since a child, but I made this commitment that summer. I said, I'm going to write a poem a day for the whole summer. And I thought, well, that's pretty demanding and awesome. I said, okay, so now what will I write about? So the first time I was sitting on my front porch, and I said, I'll just close my eyes and I'll move my head around. And when I open my eyes, the first thing that my eyes land on, I will write a poem about. I will be committed to that, whatever it is. So I closed my eyes and shook my head around, and I opened them, and I was staring at this bright blue towel, which was air drying it, draped over the porch rail. And I thought, well, okay, that's it. It's the blue towel. And so I started writing about this blue towel. And the first thing that caught my interest was how blue it was against the green landscape. Mm-hmm. It was just this incredible color out of this green that was all around it. And then as I sat with the towel, its story started to reveal itself. It's like the story of the towel was somehow embedded in its fibers, like where it was made, how it came to be, all the bodies that it had been wrapped around, and how it felt tumbling in the dryer and drying in the sun. And I thought, and it wasn't a great poem, but what it showed me was, oh, I can write about wherever my eyes rest.
It's the power of the object.
The power of the object.
The power of the object. The power of the imagery of the object itself that has such power. That's really an apt description. Very that's what poetry is in many respects. I believe that. And you started reading at the staff meetings at Packer. Is that correct?
I did. I wrote poems that summer, and I started reading to my family, and my family liked them. And I said, and the faculty was like my extended family. So I had a role at the school where I stood up at every opening faculty meeting to talk about professional development, because that's what the role I played. And I said, well, I'm just gonna go for it. I'm gonna read one of my poems because, first of all, faculty meetings are boring. They're sort of information rich, and they don't take you anywhere. And I said, I'm going to take folks to a different place. I'm going to read a poem. So I did. And it was the response was, I would say, phenomenal. I had
it sort of reminds me of you taking the dare to become Poet Laureate. Actually, you made a leap. That was a leap that you made.
It was a big leap, and it was an important leap. And I continue doing that for the next 12, 13 years. I read a poem at every single faculty meeting, and people love them.
That's quite an incentive to write. Also, would you read one of your poems that you read at the staff meeting, please?
I will. Actually, this was the first one that I read, and it's entitled, this is another food poem. Slicing a loaf of bread. It was a hefty loaf of multigrain bread, the hearty, healthy kind, and I had been slicing my way through it over the course of the week, a slice or two at a time for breakfast, and two again for a sandwich at lunch. This morning, it occurred to me to start slicing from the unsliced side, breaking a lifelong pattern of following a sacred rule of bread slicing. Start at one end and finish at the other. But whoever said that slicing bread was like writing a sentence, one end the capital and the other a period, or following a map from here to there? Why couldn't here be at both ends and there somewhere in the middle? I've been pondering this all day, wondering what other loaves I might slice anew, what other worlds I could turn upside down, what revolutions I could begin.
Nice. I like that. That's Eric Baylin. Reading Slicing a Loaf of Bread. Food and poetry are really wonderful for you, or you are wonderful for them. It's great. It's that object again that you uniquely tackle and show us different worlds within the world of the object. Wonderful. I want to ask you about your teaching. We're running out of time. I just want to ask you about how you started your sessions teaching your students. You used a singing bowl Is that what you did? I read about that. Just
Oh,
briefly
okay.
tell us about that, and then we'll go into the haikus that you've written to end the
Oh,
show.
okay. Well, school is kind of a hectic, frantic place, and students are, high school especially, are rushing from one place to another, and they'd come into my class kind of still with math running through their heads, or history, or English, how could I shift them into the state of mind to make art? And so I had discovered the singing bowl, this kind of this beautiful object that makes this extraordinary sound. And I started using it to create this interval between their coming, where they were, and to where they are now. And so it created this space of just you're not going to do anything but sit there and listen. Nothing but sit there and listen. You don't have to think about anything, do anything. And so it became this sacred moment. It was almost like a prayer. I would never have called it that in the context of the school, but it was like, we're just going to take this moment of being here together, listening, and it was magical. And then we could shift into doing whatever art we were going to do.
Sort of taking the mind out of it, which is
Yes,
always a good thing.
absolutely.
And you've written haiku. I don't know when you started to do that. Was it in conjunction with something you called the Tiny Houses Project?
Actually, it was before that. I did write for the Tiny Houses Project, which is a project in Livingston Manor at the Catskill Art Space. But I've been writing them actually. It was more the pandemic that started my haiku writing. It was like I had this practice of writing poems every day, but it was just I could only handle writing a short poem. During the pandemic. It was like it was just too much going on, and so much happening. And then what I discovered that I loved, which was so different than, say, the bagel poem, the pancake poem, which are these long narrative poems, was this concise this conciseness of the haiku, and how it compressed a feeling or an image into just these few words. So now I've been writing haikus every day for the last 3 years. and I just love it. I love it.
You have a series of for every month. Would you read a haiku for each month of the year for us?
I'd be delighted. They're all based on this beautiful valley, which is outside my window in my home in North Branch. And every morning I walk into that room and I look out at the valley, and something pops into my head, something about the weather, the light, or the changing seasons. And somehow, if I stay with it again, some metaphor emerges. So here's a round the calendar with some haikus about the valley. January. High roller snow cloud dumps all its white cash in one flurry of spending. February. 40 in February stirs the rose, rouses buds, a winter ruse. March. Valley said, I'll take mine with cream, and thick fog poured in without a stir. April. A rose, yes, by any name, but snow, seriously, in any month as sweet? May. The green urge rises through their limbs again. Ah, the love heat of leaves. June. Sky passionately lowers itself to give earth a giant wet kiss. July. Summer pudding air thickened with sunlit haze, warm and scoopable. August. Part-time billionaires, summer trees moneyed rich with green, soon bankrupt. September. Old green of autumn. Do you remember how you arrived? Fresh, fragile. October. Yellowing edges portend green's ending. Trees are yelling, the reds are coming. November. Threesome of long-necked geese, arrow flap in tandem through light morning mist. December. Snow chalks the branches, tangles of skinny white skeins, winter's first pollock.
That's Eric Baylin, the Poet Laureate Emeritus of Sullivan County, reading his delightful haiku, one for each month of the year. What a wonderful way to end a truly pleasurable show. Thank you so much, Eric Baylin. It was a delight to have you on here. And thank you, Pamela Manché Pearce, for your beautiful insights and poetry. This put me in a very good mood today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharon.
And thank you so much for listening.